Today we're going to talk about optionals. Now, this is a fairly confusing topic for beginners, but it is so important because you're going to see it everywhere in your Xcode project. To put it simply, an optional is a variable that can be empty. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but so far, all of the variables and constants that we declare, we're always assigning data to it right away. Now, this is because the data types that we've been using for those variables and constants that we declare, it has to be initialized right away. And being initialized simply means that it has data assigned to it. Now you might think, that's perfect. Why would I ever want a variable or constant to contain nothing? Because after all, didn't I tell you that variables and constants are used to keep track of data? Let me give you a scenario. Let's say you're writing an employee name search function that takes an employee ID number and goes into your database and looks for that employee's name, and then returns it as a string. Now here's the problem. That employee ID may or may not exist. If it does exist, then you return the employee name. But if he or she does not exist, then you need to be able to return something that represents nothing, or a failed search. In Swift, nothing is represented by the keyword nil. So the smart thing to do would be when you call that search function and you get some sort of result back, you'll have to use an if statement and check if that result is nil before actually using it. That's going to look something like this. So let me ask you, since this function returns data, you have to specify a return data type. What is that return data type going to be? Well, in this case, you might say it should be string because this function returns a string representing the employee name, right? But unfortunately, if you specify string as the return data type, then your function can't return nil because nil is not a string. This is where optionals come in. Instead of using a string type, you can use an optional string type. The difference is that a regular string type must contain a string value. However, an optional string type may contain a string value or it may contain nil. So there is more flexibility. Now this is perfect for our employee name search function that we're writing. Instead of specifying string as the return data type, let's see how we can specify an optional string as the return data type. And actually it's very simple. All you need to do is add a question mark to the data type like this. Now it's almost like a question asking if this contains a string value or does it contain nil. So now when you get the result back from your search function, you can use an if statement to check the optional to see if it's nil or if it actually contains a string representing the name. So far so good? Now it's going to get a little more complicated, so I want you to pay extra attention. Let's say that the function did find a name and it returns that optional string to you. Well, you want to use that result. Maybe you want to print it out to the console. However, you can't just use that optional type like that because remember, an optional type could actually contain a value or it might contain nil. And you can't really do anything with nil. Well, you might be saying that you've already used an if statement to check the optional and you've determined that the optional type does actually contain a value. How do you actually get to the value and use it? Well, to get the actual string value out of the optional, you have to do something called unwrapping the optional. Think of it this way. The optional string type is like a Christmas gift box that may contain a string value or it may contain nil. It really helps to think of that optional data type as a box, and you have to open it up to see what's inside. When you're checking using the if statement, all you're doing is like you're shaking that gift box and hearing what's inside. But shaking the gift box and hearing something inside doesn't mean that you can actually use it yet, right? You have to unwrap that gift box. So in Swift, you can unwrap the optional type by using an exclamation mark. So going back to the search function, if you want to print out the employee's name, you have to unwrap that optional result first, like this. Okay, I know it still might be a little bit hazy, but it really helps to see this in practice. So let's jump into an Xcode playground now and I'll show you what the code looks like. So here I've got a playground with just a variable called s, and I'm assigning a string piece of data into it. Now, as you know from before, even though I haven't explicitly declared that s is a string data type variable, the system is going to take a look at the first data item I assign into this variable and then infer the data type that the variable should be. So it's taking a look at this, it's supposed to be string, so it's going to set s to be a string data type. Now let me try to assign nil into s, and we know that nil means nothing, right? So you can see that nil does not count as a string type. Now, how do we change this variable so that it is an optional string type, so that it can either accept string data or the value nil? And the way we do that is by explicitly declaring that it is a string followed by a question mark. And this becomes an optional string data type. Now, if I run this again, I will be able to assign nil into this. See, perfectly fine. So as you can see, any data type can actually be turned into an optional data type by simply adding the question mark behind it. All right, so we've got this optional variable now. Let's remove this line so that the string hello is inside this optional string. How do we access that piece of data, hello? Well, you might try to say that maybe we can just print s. But s is an optional data type, so you can't just access the value like that. In order for you to get the value out of an optional data type, like I said, we have to unwrap the optional, and the way we do that is by using this exclamation mark like this. So now when I print this, you can see that I get the value hello. Now remember, unwrapping the optional, you might either get the actual string data or you might get nil. So what if I set this to nil? And I try to print it. Well, you would get this error because you're trying to do something with nil, and nil just usually represents nothing. And so there's a danger, right, to using optionals. Before you unwrap the optional and try to use the value, you had better check if it's nil or not, because then you can handle the case. If it's nil, then you might not want to do something with it. So one way to check if there is something inside the optional is just to simply use an if statement. So you say if s is not equal to nil, then you might want to print it. Otherwise, s is nil, so don't do anything. Or you might want to display a message or something like that. So now, if you run this if statement, it will only run the print if s is not nil. But since it's nil, it comes down here. So if I change this back to hello, then it will actually detect that it's not nil and come into here. Like this. So that's one way, using an if statement to check for nil, right? And unwrap the optional to get the value. Now I want to show you another way to work with optionals that you might end up preferring. Initially it's maybe a little harder to understand, but in the long run you might prefer this way. So I want to show it to you. It's called optional binding. Now don't let this technical term scare you. Let me show you exactly what it is. So it's basically something like this. If s is not nil, then let's say a, we'll use a, equals the unwrapped value, and then now you can use a. So now you would print a. So right now, this is not actually optional binding. Let me work my way towards it. So what are we looking at here? We're checking the optional to see if it's not nil. If it's not nil, it comes into this if statement, and then it's going to unwrap that optional to get the actual value, because we've determined that there is a value, and then we're assigning that value into the constant a. And then from this point on, we're going to be using a. Now, optional binding takes all of that and does it in one line. So this is what it looks like. If let a equal s, print a. So this line checks for nil and assigns value into constant a. That's this whole line right here does the equivalent of this. So that's a much easier way to understand it, but as you can see, it does take your head a little bit to remember how this syntax looks like. But you know, once you're able to remember this optional binding syntax, then inside this if statement, you can simply use a, which represents the value. If it's nil, it's just going to fail this check, and it's not going to assign it to a, and then you're just going to continue on down here. It's not even going to run the code in here if it's nil. So that's another way to check for nil. Now with optionals, there's something else called optional chaining. Now it's another fancy technical term, but it's actually pretty easy to understand. But first I have to declare our old spaceship class in order to demonstrate this principle. So I'm gonna just write optional chaining right here, and I am going to declare our buddy here, spaceship class. So we're gonna have a cruise method, and we'll just print spaceship cruise. All right, and then let me just create some more space up here so you can see. And we are going to declare a new spaceship. I'm gonna call it 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗲. I'm actually gonna make it a variable. And we are going to make this type an optional spaceship. Yes, you can even make your custom classes here optional types. So I'm going to declare a new spaceship like that. And what we want to do with this guy is call the cruise method. But remember, 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗲 is an optional data type. That means that 𝗧𝗶𝗺 may contain an actual spaceship object, or it could contain nil. So the right thing to do would be to either use an if statement, you know, this method up here, to check if it's nil first, or to use optional binding. Now I'm going to opt for using this if statement right here, just so it's a little easier to understand, just in case you're not used to the optional binding syntax yet. So very simply, I can say if 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗃 is not equal to nil, that means it actually does contain a spaceship object, then I'll say unwrap it, right, to get the actual value or object out of it. And then I'm going to call cruise on the actual object or value. So let's run this, and you see down here, spaceship cruise. Now, if let's say this was nil, and I tried to do this, right, it wouldn't print out, right, because we have this safety check here. What if I didn't have the safety check? Well, you can kind of expect what would happen. We'd get a crash, right? Because we are unwrapping the optional, and then we're trying to call the cruise method on nil. And obviously, that's not going to go well. So this is actually where optional chaining comes in. It's another safety mechanism that's going to help us. Let me show you how it works. So if I type 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗃 and I don't have an if check to see if it's nil or not, I can just go ahead and call cruise, and you'll see that Xcode automatically puts this question mark before I call the cruise method, because it recognizes that 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗃 is an optional type, right? So this is called optional chaining, and what it does is it only calls the cruise method if 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗃 is not nil. So what is optional chaining useful for? Well, when you want to call a property or a method of a class and it's an optional data type, you can specify a question mark before you call that method or property, and it will safely do it because it's only going to execute this if spaceship is not nil. So let me run this for you. It's not going to run this piece of code, and it's not going to crash because it recognizes that 𝗧𝗶𝗺𝗃 is nil. But if I put an actual spaceship in there and I run this, then you're actually going to get spaceship cruise. So that's another short form way, instead of having to check that. You know, if you've already checked that it's not nil, then you could just force unwrap it because you know it does contain an object. You know, so don't worry too much about optional chaining. I mean, it is convenience, right? But the core concepts I really want you to understand is that For optionals, it is declared like this with a question mark, and it may contain nil, or it might actually contain the value or the object, and that before you use it, you need to check that it's not nil, either using the if statement or using optional binding. So just in case you download this playground as a reference, I'm going to get rid of this because this is not actually optional binding. This was just the example I gave you to lead you to the actual optional binding syntax, which is this. So I'm going to just get rid of this, and just remember that optional binding basically checks S for nil, and if it's not nil, assigns it to the constant A. So I've just taught you a lot about optionals, and you might be wondering in your head, why do we even need optionals? Why does Swift make us jump through so many hoops? Because in a lot of other programming languages, you can assign nil to your variables without having to explicitly say that that variable can accept nil. And just because we have, a string data type and an optional string data type forces us to do all of these different things. Well, actually, it's for our own protection, believe it or not, because having to explicitly specify that your data type should be able to contain nil, that forces us to have some foresight and think about whether or not that variable has to contain nil at all. And there is some level of comfort knowing that if your variable is not optional, that you can always rely on it to contain a value or object that you can use. Because in the past, a lot of programs and apps crash because programmers expect to use some sort of variable or value, but it just didn't exist. And when you try to use it, the app or program blows up. And so, believe it or not, it's actually for our own protection. But as with anything, there's always an option for risk takers and adventurers, and there's no exception here. There is something called implicitly unwrapped optionals that lets you put nil into it, but at the same time, you don't have to do all of this checking and unwrapping. So let me show you how that works. Here, I'm going to call this part implicitly unwrapped optionals. And sometimes I think one of the reasons why optionals is so difficult to understand is because they create all of these terms that sound really technical for the average person, and it makes things look so scary, but actually they're pretty simple concepts once you get your head around it. So I'm going to declare a new implicitly unwrapped optional just to show you what it is. S3. I'm going to say spaceship, use our spaceship type, and instead of putting a question mark behind it, that would be an optional spaceship type, I'm going to put an exclamation mark. And this is now an implicitly unwrapped optional. So let me put a spaceship object into it. If I write sc.cruise, oh, not sc, sorry. I was surprised there because that was not the result I was expecting. S3.cruise, you can see that Xcode does not put an optional chaining question mark there, right? Because remember, we don't have to unwrap anything to get to the value. And you'll still get spaceship cruise. However, if I put nil here, right, we're going to get a crash because there's no more safety checking. It doesn't force you to check S3 if it's nil or not. It's really up to you now. And you're able to assign nil into it because it is still an optional, but it's an implicitly unwrapped optional. So it's always unwrapped and you can just use it as is. Generally speaking, you probably wouldn't want to use this. You will see this as you're building your app. One example is when you connect your user interface elements from the storyboard to your code behind or your view controller, you'll see that the 𝗍𝗶𝗱𝗲 property that gets created actually is an implicitly unwrapped optional. And the reason for that is because at the time of declaring that 𝗍𝗶𝗱𝗲 property, there's no value to assign to it. But once your app launches and all of those user elements from your storyboard gets turned into objects, at that point it gets assigned to your 𝗍𝗶𝗱𝗲 property. So there's guaranteed to be a value in that IB outlet property, as long as it's properly connected to an element in the storyboard, of course. So again, generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend you to use implicitly unwrapped optionals until you're confident about what you're doing. Using the regular optionals will just force you to write code that is safer and will crash less often. And will force you to think ahead. Alright, in this lesson you learned about what optionals are and why they're needed. You also learned that any data type can be an optional by adding the question mark after the data type. You learned that in order to find out if that optional contains data or if it contains nil, you have to unwrap it first using the exclamation mark. But before you unwrap it to use it and find out, you should use the if statement to check if that optional actually contains data or not. Lastly, you learned that you can declare a variable that can contain nil, but it's not an optional by using the exclamation mark and also the dangers that are associated with doing that. Now I know these concepts are a little hard to grasp and sometimes it takes a little bit of time for it to sink in. And that's why I highly recommend that you do the exercises and worksheets for this lesson because I know it's going to help aid your understanding and practice makes perfect. Alright, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson.